Good day, everyone. This is Jack Van Horn from the Big Data to Knowledge Training Coordinating Center located at the University of Southern California, and I'd like to welcome you to the next in our series of Big Data to Knowledge Guide to the Fundamentals of Data Science. We're absolutely delighted to have Susanna-Assunta Sansone from the University of Oxford speaking to us today on metadata standards. Susanna is the Associate Director at the Oxford E-Research Center, which is a department at the University of Oxford, and her research focuses on data representation, curation, management to support data reproducibility, and the evolution of scholarly publishing, which drives science as well as discoveries. She's the principal investigator leading a number of programs in the UK and the European Commission, as well as being a participant in the NIH's BD2K activities. She's also the vice chair of the Dryad board and a board member of the Elixir UK node, which is the sort of a European analog of the Big Data to Knowledge program, the Research Data Alliance, and the Force 11 Task Force. She has founding honorary academic editor of Springer Nature's Scientific Data Open Access Journal. And today she's going to be talking about metadata standards and the interoperability of standards to be able to promote operational processes underlying exchange and sharing of information between different systems, and how these relate to the FAIR principles, that is, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Susanna. Thank you so much for joining us, Susanna.
Thank you so much for having me. And good morning or good afternoon, depends where you are. Okay, so here is the outline of my lecture today. So I plan to actually first introduce the landscape of standards, and starting with interoperability standard. I'll then narrow down the area and focus on metadata and content standard, and I'll explain you what those are, what they're useful for, and also illustrating the life cycle of those efforts and few key players. I'll close to discuss actually it's important to help producer of the standard and consumer of the standard to both make discoverable those resources and for the consumer to actually find the right resource appropriate to its or her case. Okay, so let's start with a definition. What is a standard? And of course, this is a definition because there are many. But let's say that it's actually an agreed upon convention on doing something. And it can be established by an authority or by a grassroots group. What I really want to define actually are the interoperability standard, which is one type of standard very relevant to what we do and what the scope of this talk is. And the best example to use actually, it's one of the nuts and bolts. And therefore, let's use engineering. Engineering in the 19th century wasn't as easy as it is actually now. Now you go and buy the right nuts, they fit the right bolts, and that's it. You know that they will work together. That certainly wasn't the case before standards actually were defined, and that was actually in the mid 19th century. But those standards, although were initiated quite early, were only adopted after the Second World War, so a century after, and that's quite an interesting thing to bear in mind, because from the development to the adoption of standard, there is a very big time gap. Now, let's talk, of course, about interoperability standards in our area, in the life science and biomedical sciences. So what we are interested in are interoperability standard for digital object, research output being data or code, algorithm, workflow, model, software, or even paper, of course. So actually, in our cases, those are also agreed upon specification, guidelines, or criteria. And they are designed to ensure that these research objects, digital research objects, are fair. And fair actually means findable, are accessible, are interoperable, and are reusable. So Interoperability standards are enablers, and they enable us to do better science in a more efficient way to actually have straightforward access and reuse of these digital objects. If you're not familiar with what FAIR stands for and what FAIR is and the work behind it, or what the principles say in detail, I will actually refer you to this ready material. So this is a publication in Scientific Data that a group of grassroots organization, but also, as you can see, funders, the BD2K or infrastructure developer and service provider, being Elixir or other grassroots organization and advocator within the RDA, the Force 11, etc., have actually promoted and have endorsed. So the FAIR principle are really very precise and measurable set of guidelines that allow a digital object and service provider that have infrastructure for those digital objects to make sure that those are actually fair, fundable, accessible, and reusable. It really, the FAIR principle stress the fact that the digital object should be just human readable, but should also be accessible to machine. And the article contains a few examples of implementations that are working towards making data holdings fair, actually, because FAIR have certain, there are different metrics which actually are being devised as well by a working group within the BD2K. And those are just few examples. And as you can see, there are groups within the BD2K which are also working towards making data fair or even standard fair. But I will touch upon those as we go along in the talk. So let's go back to define the fundamentals of the interoperability standards. So they are essential for discovering data or code or software and etc. But they're also essential to allow to cite those digital objects and therefore give credit and recognition to the person that has actually shared and make this object fair. So we can say that actually the nuts and the bolts of the interoperability standards are metadata and identifiers. So these are the essential elements to build an interoperable machine. And metadata and identifiers are essential to the underlying process, the operational process of interoperability, which will allow data or any other digital object to be aggregated, to be integrated with another, to be compared, to be exchanged. So although identifiers, it's not the focus of this presentation, because actually it requires a presentation on its own, I would like to give you some pointers and some reading material, because there is a lot of efforts around defining unique, resolvable, and versionable identifiers, which are essential for digital objects. So there are several efforts within the Force 11 group, being the Resource Identification Initiative, and I believe Anita Wendowski might actually present this in the next lecture next week. There are identifiers for researcher defined by the ORCID, identified for data set, like for data sites, and so on and so forth. And there is also quite nice summary document which will provide you simple rules for designing and providing and reuse persisting identifiers, and that's the reference that you can see actually there. There is a preprint in Zenodo, and the paper has actually been submitted. So let's focus now especially on the metadata element, this interoperability standards. So but both identifiers and metadata need to be actually implemented by technical experts. So to have a machine that works well, you need to put together the nuts and the bolts, and that's where you need the technical expertise. You need the modelers, you need the ontologists, you need the software developers, and so on and so forth. And we need tools, we need registry, we need catalogs of these digital objects, we need databases for data, we need service around all of this, because we need to ensure that the researcher can actually find, can actually store, can actually manage all this information. And they can do all they need to do in their own research activity. But we need to allow them to make all this quite seamless. And to do that, we need to make sure that this interoperability standard, these nuts and bolts, are invisible to them. Because usually researchers have very little actually knowledge and unfortunately very little interest in wanting to know what this metadata is and what they should use and so on and so forth. So making interoperable standard invisible, it's the key to actually their adoption and their success at the end. So talking about metadata in particular, now metadata, it's actually, it's a descriptor. It's a descriptor for a digital object that will help someone actually to understand what that digital object is, or where it is, or how it can be accessed, or who owns this digital object, and so on and so forth. And the type, of course, of descriptors that we will find or we can use for a digital object really varies, depends on the object itself. And the depth and the breadth as well will vary depending on the type of thing we enable others to do. So what actually this means, that descriptor for discovery or descriptor for citation, or for example for credit, might be actually different for them from the metadata that one required to enable reproducibility of a certain data set. Reproducibility will require a richer and deeper level of actually metadata. Let me give you some example now. Example for software, digital object software. There are several efforts out there actually trying to tackle this area, especially because all the infrastructure that supports the discovery and the preservation of software lag behind many of the other digital objects. And there is a quite actually a great report from an NIH workshop, which was held in 2014. It's the Software Discovery Index workshop, which really documents the need for infrastructure around software and some of the efforts which are in progress. I want to highlight one of those efforts, which is called CodeMeta. CodeMeta brings together academics from around the world and vendors and commercial entity which are stakeholders in the area, and they are working to developing what they call a crosswalk table that will help to translate the different descriptors used for code and for software. And this will certainly enhance discoverability and reuse of software. There is another effort which instead focuses on the metadata for content in websites in services, data services, for example. And this effort is called Bioschema. So Bioschema actually brings together groups from the NIH, from the Elixir, from commercial entities like Google and many others. And it supports the use of schema.org, which is a structured semantic markup, which is used by Google, by Bing, by Yahoo, by the major search engine. And it's coordinating the extension of the schema.org into the life science domain. And this is so that data or events or software or training material or standards which are described in this or served in these services will be more discoverable by those search engines. And I want to flag that, of course, data is one of the key areas. And Lucila Machado already presented the effort by BioCandy and the DataMed, the data index, which is underpinned by a model, which is also being mapped and is expressed with the schema.org vocabulary. And because this lecture is about standards, I got to flag as well that standard is one of the content being tackled by schema.org. And the biosharing group, which I will mention later in my talk, it's also participating. So this will ensure that also standards which are described in this registry will be more discoverable to widely used search engines. And this is all because of the metadata, the common metadata from schema.org extended to those domains. So metadata standards are key to science, and I want to use the word that actually Mark Musen used in his first lecture, opening this series, where he said that to be a data parasite, you can only be a data parasite if you can access the data, you can find and access the data, and the data is available in standard format, and there is enough metadata that you can actually understand what the data is to reuse it. So that's really what metadata standards are. They are enablers for science, to do better science. The truth is that we already know, actually, most of the data or the other digital objects which are shared aren't exactly findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and for many reasons. Because the metadata isn't rich enough, because the metadata is not harmonized, is the heterogeneity, because things are not very well linked, they're not very well identified, and therefore they're not well cited, or they're not stored in the right place, and so on and so forth. And this is true also because those that share those digital objects see this as a very time-consuming activity, having to add rich metadata to describe your work so that somebody else can reuse it. It's not exactly, unfortunately, someone's priority. And so curation activities are seen as, you know, some sort of second-class citizen type of work, which is not the case, because I want to echo the presentation by Pascal Godet about biocuration and the importance of professionalize the curation, professionalize the use of standards in data curation, because this is essential. This is just an example, one of many that actually you can find of the importance of metadata. So we share a file, we share a data file. This is, in this case, is let's say an Excel spreadsheet with some information in it. But certainly, just having key annotation and in a very clear manner, in an ambiguous, expressed in an ambiguous manner, it's actually key to ensure that the data is actually fair at the end. This is an example when actually information are unclear, and they are only clear to the person that they share it, but not to a third party. Of course, this is an example where everything is clearer, and is expressed, and so on and so forth. Let's actually now move from the metadata standard to the content standard. So content standards, it's a type of metadata standards. And let me also say that this type of classification that you see here, it's something that I put together and with several colleagues, because there isn't an accepted way to classify actually the type of standards, but it's a simple way to show that indeed are nested. So content standard, it's a type of metadata standard, which is very much covers descriptor at the domain level. So, and that is essential for interpretation, are essential for verification, reproducibility, and reusability of a data set. I didn't mention before that metadata for citing, let's say, data set, it's less rich than metadata for interpreting or reproducing, where you need a high level of detail of what actually has been done. And the breadth and depth of those descriptions vary depending on the type of study one is actually doing. But generally, what they cover, it's what was done, who did it, when was it done, how was it done, and actually why. So content standard allow both experimental components, the design, all the condition, all the parameter of the experiment, the fundamental, let's say, biological entity which had been studied, or any other concept which has been studied, in the analytical process, all the mathematical model, and or any simulation that has been done, to be harmonized with respect to structure, format, and annotation. So then when we share it, we will actually know what part is the experiment, where is the design, where was the condition, which are the parameter. So structure is essential, not just to discovery, but to interpret, to understand, and then be able to reuse it. Let's use an example, a very, very simple example. So this is just some free text of a part of an experiment, or a very simple one. So what does it mean structuring the information? Structuring information means abstracting the key element, the key metadata, the key content metadata out of this information, so that when you look at the text, you will see the structure. You immediately see that 7 weeks is the age, and you immediately see that the mice, it's actually the strain name, and it's the subject of this experiment. You immediately see that the liver, it's actually the anatomical part that has been used. You immediately see where the protocols are, and you can immediately see the type of protocol that this information is part of, and etc. Now, let's use another example. I do work also for scientific data, so please allow me to use this as a simple example. So this is just a data journal where data publication are actually anchored to structure metadata, as simple as this. So if you go on the website, on the center part of the homepage, you will find the ICE Explorer. What the ICE Explorer actually is, it's just a simple tool that reads and visualizes the experimental metadata, which has been curated by a curator editor, which is Vasha, which is there. And so she goes from free text to structure. So that what this then implemented in the tool will allow the user to immediately find a data paper which is relevant to their type of design that they're interested, or the type of organism that they're interested, or using the technology that they're interested, and a combination of these. And I can't stress more the value of actually curation. And again, here I have a tiny screenshot of Pascal presentation, because it is essential. Standards are enablers, but professionals like curator are those that put the standard in action. Okay, so now let's look what are the type of content standard which are out there. And again, there isn't any a widely agreed classification on the content standards. And this is just a way to give some structure to what is out there. I classify content standards in 3 types. There are guidelines, terminology, and format. So the guidelines, starting from the right-hand side, are what other people also call the minimum information guidelines checklists. You might know Miami guidelines, for example. This was one of the first, published in 2001. It's the minimum information about microarray experiments, and Miami launched the trend, and there are a lot of minimum information now covering different domains on different technology. So the guidelines are essential because the community design and define what are the metadata that need to be reported. What is the essential metadata that need to be reported so that somebody else can actually understand what was done. There are terminology. Now, terminology widely cover control vocabulary, taxonomy, thesauri, ontology, and so on and so forth. And they are essential because we provide an unambiguous identification and definition of those core information which has been reported. And gene ontology, and it's an example of an ontology. Now, I'm not going to go in more detail because Michel Demontier did an excellent job in presenting ontology. The third type of a standard, it's actually the format. So those are contain broadly conceptual model, schema, exchange format, and etc. And this represents the structure which interrelate information and will allow, for example, to share data from one system to another. And FASTA file, it's an example of a format. There is a fourth type, actually, of standard, which is slightly different, also because it's been developed for somehow in a specific domain, and it's driven specific by healthcare industry needs. And these are the common data element, or CDE, which actually they support both patient care but also secondary use of this data for example, disease surveillance, population and public health, clinical research, but also reimbursement. Let's look actually now at content standard in numbers, because there are a lot of those. So I would say that more or less there are thousands, I would say, among guideline terminology and format. And the number comes, as you can see, from the bioportal and the biosharing as a sources combined. In terms of common data elements, taken the NIH Common Data Element Repository as a reference, and there are almost 20,000 elements here. Let's now start looking a little bit at the community which developed those standards, what the motivation is, who they are, how they're assembled, how do they create the standard, what's the life cycle of the standard, because it's really important to understand who produced the standard, why they are being produced, and etc. So I think again here there isn't an agreed way to classify the groups, but I divide them between a de facto standard, which are the grassroots initiative, like the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, the Proteomics Standard Initiative, Metabolomics Standard Initiative, the Genomics Standard Initiative, the imaging groups, and so on and so forth. So those are really bottom-up community which have an interesting, perhaps sharing data between systems, and the standard which they develop are always free to use. They're mostly volunteer effort. Actually, they are all volunteer efforts, and they tend to have very little money to do the work, but also to provide training and etc. Conversely, you have the standard developing organization on the other side, which are more formal authority. The openness to participation here really vary. Not all of them are open. You need to be member or actually nationally nominated to be from your national representative and so on and so forth. It really depends on the group. In many cases, the standard by those groups are actually sold or licensed. And in the best case scenario, the license at no cost, but not all of them. And usually charge supply if you want a training or you want a programmatic access to these standards. And that's why they're self-supportive. But that's also why the grassroots initiatives struggle with funds, because everything is free, everything is open. It is a complex landscape out there. And in order to understand what a group does, it's also important to understand that standards have been developed from different perspectives, and they have a different focus, actually. So there are groups which are focused on a specific biological or clinical domain, so they're interested in neuroscience. But there are others that come together because they want to model processes, or there are others which are interested in bioimaging, no matter the sample, no matter the application. So some come from the biological perspective, and others from the technological perspective. The motivation by which, for which this group come together also vary. There are some that actually create new standard, or they want to fill a gap that's existing between a certain standard. Some actually come together to map, to harmonize effort which can be complemented and contrasting. Some try to do extensions. Some try to repurpose the standard for other cases. Also, the type of people that participate in this effort, it's really very diverse. And actually, it should be the case, because it is essential that all the stakeholders are represented. So it is essential to have the technologists, the one that bring the knowledge, the builders, the ontologists, the modelers, and etc. But it's also important to have the researcher, the end users, because they bring the use cases. So you need both. You need the consumer and the producer at the same time. And generally this group to have representative from academia, industry, governmental, and funding agency as well. And you see people that are actually involved in the sector, and they cover different roles, but they all manage somehow digital object, because that's the reason why you would want to volunteer and participate in this effort. Understanding the landscape, understanding what's out there, how we can use content standard, what's ready to use, what need to be further developed, etc., is also been and now can be supported, has been the focus of a couple of B2K workshop on standards. And here there's the reference to one in 2013 and one in 2015. The one in 2013 has a longer report as well available, and the other 15 also has a report available. Now, both workshops have highlighted that, of course, standards are essential. We need to build them. We need to understand how to help the community to build them. And in understanding how to help, it's also important to highlight what the challenges are and what the pain points are. And it's both a workshop to highlight that the pain points are quite the same. And it's not just a technical problem, it's also a social problem. And social engineering is as important as technical engineering in these cases. And they also illustrate the fact that life cycles of the standard, they seem to be quite the same regardless the type of organization. And here let me spend a couple of slides in explaining you what the life cycle of this standard development is. There are three phases. The first phase is called formulation, where actually the groups come together, the right people are assembled. But that's where it's very important to assemble the right people, to have the right expertise, the right variety and the heterogeneity as well. This is when use cases are identified, the scope is defined, what is in and what is not, what is in and what is out is also important, and the prioritization is important. This is just an example to say that collecting competency questions, it's one of the first things that this group do, and then write them in formal questions to decide what's in and what's out, and then from those questions they start to abstract what are the metadata that are needed, and then decide how this can be structured and represented, and etc. The formulation phase is followed by a development phase, and this is done in iteration. It's usually done by a smaller group, and this is especially true in grassroots organization when there is little money. So very few people actually have the time, the possibility to come and do the work together for the others. But it's also important to engage, continue maintain engagement with the broader community for testing, for getting feedback, for having evaluation cycles. That's essential. And it's also very important this phase to be able to actually harmonize the different perspectives that the people working in this in the effort have, and what the options are, the technical option and the solution. A third phase of this life cycle is called maintenance. Now, maintenance, it's when this community start building exemplary implementation. So this is the phase where you actually start to implement and making the standard invisible. So you have the tool, the databases, and the services. They make everything invisible and usable. This is also the phase where it's essential to have documentation, both technical documentation, but also user guides, education material, some metrics by which people can understand if they're actually meeting or not the standards. It's also a phase where the communities start thinking about how to sustain themselves. How do they move in the next phase? Because standards, it's not something that is done and is static. It's a very dynamic thing. And science change. There is a new type of process to explore, or the process is actually enriched by new information, or there is a new technology out, and therefore standards need to be extended, adjusted, adapted. They need to evolve as science evolves. There are versions, and there is backward compatibility with this version. There are conversion models, and etc. So it's not a trivial thing. Embarking in developing standard, it's a kind of lifelong commitment, I would say. Let me also highlight a couple of pain points, because it is important if you are a producer or if you are a consumer of the standard to be aware of what the difficulties is if you are building it or if you're trying to use it. There are key issues. One is the fragmentation. There are so many activities, and this is great because they are rooted in real needs, use cases. You know, if you are an epidemiologist, why would you want to develop a standard for plants? Fair enough, of course you don't. So you assemble the community which, like you, has the same interest. But what actually happened that because this community are so diverse and they have their own environment to work, they might tend to duplicate, unnecessary duplicate, perhaps metadata elements which are common regardless the type of biological sample you use or regarding the technology you use. And this picture is actually trying to illustrate the problem of fragmentation. And I can go on forever to explain fragmentation, but I don't want. I think this actually does give enough of a picture of the difficulties. There are other pain points besides fragmentation, which is, of course, you need to coordinate all the effort, you need to harmonize, you need to handle extensions. How do you incentivize the people that work with you, all the contributors? How do you get somebody else to come in because you need a new expertise? How do you manage governance when you have, for example, industry to participate? Or who owns the standard? Who owns a set of standard? Do you own the definition of the standard? Do you own the use case of the standard? There's no ownership, especially in grassroots initiative. But it is essential because people want some rewards and want some credit when contributing. Funding stream, it's always a problem, although it's important to acknowledge that especially the NIH has launched a specific funding program for standard. This is going to be essential to help the community. There is also an important pain point, which is indicator and evaluation method. It's really hard sometimes to understand if a standard is successful, has been successful, and why, has helped, and how. Implementation, as I said, are essential. It's essential to make the standard invisible, so we need the tools. The outreach and engagement, it's always critical. This is the social engineering part. There is another important factor here, which is the synergy, or I would say the lack of synergy, between the efforts which are around basic research and those that come more in the healthcare and clinical and medical area. There's very much a division there. There is a divide, we need a bridge. And of course, the education, documentation, and training, it's really very time consuming, and especially the grassroots volunteer, which are volunteer job, actually struggle to develop enough material, keep up with updating the material. And of course, a business model for sustainability will be essential. And this is something which is hard to actually identify. Okay, this brings me, I have 14 minutes left, and brings me to somehow the last part of my lecture. Well, I want to more discuss, okay, we have this standards, we have this wealth of standard out there, especially content standard that I'm focusing on, but I am a consumer of this standard, so where do I go to find what I need, and who can help me to find what I need? Or I am a producer of a standard, I've just produced a beautiful format with all my community. How do I make sure that my format is actually visible to other people which are operating in the same area that perhaps could join forces with us? Or at least I will make sure that they're not duplicating it if I make it visible. So understanding the standard, understanding the context of standard, as I said, is essential for consumer and for producer of the standards. And these actually are, beside the question of just the example of the question I've just said, there are many others. So, for example, you have curator and developers who want to use the latest version of a certain ontology to make sure that they are annotating it with the right version, or a developer wants to create a data submission tool and wants to know what the latest format, the database they're targeting uses. So they want to know if something has been deprecated or replaced by something else. The researcher, of course, have questions which are, in a way, simpler because they just want to know which standard it's good for their toxicological data, or which standard it's actually endorsed, which standard is more recommended, but we also need to bear in mind that as part of the stakeholder here scenario, there are also the funders and the journal editors and others, being librarians or research data manager, which actually are creating guidelines, policy to the authors, the awardees, the research community, and they also need to be guided. They also want to know, they also have the same questions. Which standard do I recommend in this policy? Is there a list which is approved by this community? Or actually, which one have been funded? Or which one are implemented in a certain database? Okay, so let me give you a couple of direction here, where to go, where you can find things. But let me also tell you that there isn't a single place where you find everything, because this is a landscape which is being mapped. So if you focus on ontology, well, certainly I would say you go to the bioportal. That's where you deposit your ontology, your files, and you make it visible. Also because bioportal isn't just a repository of an ontology. It provides you with tools to do many other things, mapping, annotating, and etc. If you are in ontology engineering and you are building an ontology, and you want to make sure that when you build it, you are following a proper guidelines, proper principle to ensure that your ontology will be a piece of a puzzle, will be interoperable, will be orthogonal to another ontology, then I would say the Open Foundry is the place to go to get the guidelines and to actually then make sure that your ontology, it's also present in the Open Foundry so that you are part of this larger community of people creating orthogonal ontology. Now, ontology, it's only one type of standards, of content standards, as expressed before. There are formats, there are the checklists, but then there are also the tools that implement the standard. There are the database that implement the standard. And I think what's important is to bring this landscape together, because in order to tell you if a standard is mature, one good indicator of a maturity could be that the database has implemented, because it means that has been tested, that there is data annotated with it. At least you can verify and see if that standard works for you, if that standard has improved the quality of the reporting of that data set. So even indicators of maturity are not being developed. So that's the reason why I also want you to point to the biosharing, which is also part of this ELIX infrastructure. The biosharing, it's a curated and informative and education resource which links the standard, in this case is at the moment only content standards, to database and to policy, to understand who use what. So the idea, it's really to map the landscape, to monitor the development and the evolution of the standard. It isn't just to say, oh, this standard exists. Is this standard the latest version? Is the community still supporting it? Has been implemented, has been used? So the biosharing connects to the bioportal because it's essential that it's the same list of terminology and ontology, but extends to format, to model, reporting guideline, etc., and link these to databases. Another message that actually I want to bring up is that standards are digital objects. So I have talked so far actually about standard being enablers. They enable the standard enable digital object to be fair, but actually standards are digital objects on their own right, and they also need to be fair. So standards need to be findable at the very least and accessible, and of course interoperable and reusable. Okay, so let's say that these portals at least really address the findability of the standard, accessibility of the standards specifically. This is one of those slides that nobody can read, but the reason why I wanted to take a screenshot of a record in the biosharing portal that describe the standards. In this case, it's the System Biology Markup Language, SBML. It's because also a record, also the standard needs content standard, needs content descriptors. It is important that to be findable, the standard has its own key descriptors so that people can use those descriptors to find information they want. So it is important to describe the standard to say whose group is creating it, for which taxonomical range is this standard applicable, what area does this standard cover? And this is really tricky. So in this case, this is, of course, this computational model, but it's also for molecular entity, for pathway, and etc. So it's important to tag the standard in a way to make it discoverable. It's important to say if there is support, who the group is, who is maintaining the record, who is updating the record, who has funded the standards, are there publication associated, are they related standard, and so on and so forth. And this is what we meant mapping the landscape, describing the standards so that's fundable. But doesn't just mean that. In order for a consumer to actually pick the right one, and the right in quotation, I say, you need to have indicators. Now, those indicators, as of now, do not exist, but this is what actually is being developed. And hopefully, pretty soon, there will be a set of indicators that do help you choose, and those indicators will be richer and richer as the community agrees on what is the right indicator to use. So at the moment, in the biosharing, for example, use only few indicators to start with. It lists marks what's ready for implementation, what's in development, what's uncertain, and what's been deprecated. And all these tags are actually vetted with the community which is behind the standards. An uncertain status might mean that perhaps the group is no longer active. So the standards there is still good, perhaps. It could be even used by databases, but the community behind it is no longer active. In development, it's just started. Ready to use in implementation means it's either ready and not yet been implemented or even been implemented. Let me show an example using the standards by the links group, which is part of DNH, BD2K. So these are just two records. They show the link standard for reporting cell line. It's a reporting guideline on the left-hand side. It's a version which has been deprecated. So it's a version 1 deprecated, which has been superseded by another version 2. And this is important because you might have people who have used the version 1, and they need to understand that they still need to find the version of the standard, but they will need to be directed to use the latest version. And when it's possible and when it's known, the biosharing works with the community, in this case the links community, to understand the reason for this, in this case this deprecation, and justify the reasons so that this reason becomes public. And somebody who comes to the registry and look for the, or come and discover the link standard knows the why it's been deprecated. So searching the standard can be tricky and is tricky at the moment because, you know, it's important to classify them and categorize them, and this portal, it's work in progress, of course. But it's also, I also want to highlight the fact that there are ways to get packaged information. So there are ways to package a set of standards that perhaps it's important for your domain. You know, it's around pathway information, or it's for clinical data, or it's for imaging. It's possible to actually package and group records. And we are working with the community to try to pre-package the standards so that we can direct you to a group of standards for a certain domain. And so it makes actually the search and the discovery easier. But I want to go one level deeper. I know that I only have 4 minutes in front of me. I should actually make it. This is the last topic I will cover. It's going deeper now. So what I'm showing you here is that the 3 types of standard, guideline, terminology, and format, actually are related to each other. There are relations that need to be built. For someone actually to know what guidelines it's implemented by database, or actually if there is a terminology which the guidelines recommends, or if there is a format that the guidelines recommend, we need to actually build this relation. And we need them discoverable so that standards are used. It's a complex web of relation, and let me give you an example, hopefully a simple one. So on the left-hand side, you see 2 databases. I've taken the most, well-known databases in CBI Geo and EBI Express for gene expression data, transcriptomics data. Now, both databases implement a checklist, a reporting guideline called Miami, right? But actually, the 2 databases require different type of format for data submission. Geo implements the binary format, and not just that one, one out of many. I just want to simplify the example. Express requires a data submission in each tag. Now, this relation needs to be built, and indeed, what I'm showing to you that those databases use more than just that standard. They use more standards, and nevertheless, they both use the same reporting guidelines implemented in different formats, expressed with different terminology. So if somebody wants to, if a developer comes and say, oh, I want to build a data submission to Geo, a tool that's submitted to Geo, which is the standard Geo use, they will be able to actually trace back and understand, looking at the registry, looking at these relations. So a couple of slides here, which seems very hard to read, but actually are hard to read, really show you how this network relation, it's really quite complicated, and although it's very useful. So this is just an illustration of the relation between standard databases and policy, which are recommended by different journals. But the reason for illustrating this relation is essential because, as you can see from this very now dense graph, network graph here, it's what I'm showing you here. It's that although there is a relation between certain standard databases that policy recommend, there are many more standards or in databases that, for example, a journal could recommend, that a user could pick that's relevant to he or she. But actually, they're not necessarily immediately seen because there is so much. And the user needs to be guided. You need to be guided if you're looking for the right standard. So what we are creating, it's a sort of network that will inform and guide what's really important. Let me only point you very briefly on the right-hand side, for example. You can actually see orange dots that represent databases, which are recommended by the PLOS data sharing policy, okay? But as you can see, those databases here, these are model databases, all of them use a standard, all of them use an ontology, which is Go, which is in gray and is just behind. So by showing to the PLOS editor that actually those databases that we recommend also use a standard will be essential because the PLOS policy can evolve and they can recommend Go as a standard as well for the annotation. And crediting and recommendation of the standard as well, and so broader visibility, it is essential to help the community to actually keep building it, make it even more usable, and etc. And I've just realized from my watch that I've reached the 50 minutes, and I want to close with this summary slide, which actually isn't a summary slide, it's a reading material slide. Which points again to the report from the 2NH workshop, which are, I think, very informative in terms of standards, metadata, and community. And many people have contributed to those workshops and the report. I also want to point you to the FAIR paper by Wilkinson et al., and also a report that myself and a colleague have put together as a part of the Wellcome Trust Literature Review and Think Piece, which unfortunately is still being made available, but this is the link, and I've been told that in a week or so will be available. And I want to close with a message that says that actually, as the data science grow, digital output are being recognized as first-class citizen. I think we need to go a further step, one step further, and also recognize that standards and interoperability standards are digital objects in their own right, and they have to come with their own associated research, development, and educational activity. Thank you.
Susanna, that was really outstanding. Thank you so much for this fantastic lecture on metadata standards, and so comprehensive, really a tour de force lecture. Thank you. So we do have a few questions already lined up. I'd like to encourage those of you listening to, if you have some questions, you can use the question feature on the GoToWebinar panel there on the probably right side of your screen, and to encourage you to submit some questions, and we'll try to get to them all if we have time. The first question that is got my attention here is, what suggestions do you have, Susanna, for how to bridge the experts, the decision makers, and the implementers in this process of standards development, of use, and practice?
Well, the best advice, it's really what the community are doing. They're actually bringing those stakeholders at the table from the beginning, at formulation phase. So it is essential, as I illustrated during the life cycle, that the formulation phase includes all stakeholders, not the one that they will build the standards, but also the one that they will use it and implement it. It is essential to bring them at the table from the very beginning. It doesn't ensure adoption, but it will certainly give the best shot.
Yeah, I would say that that is a very important element of this. Otherwise, you run this danger of a sort of not invented here sort of syndrome
Yes.
amongst some people who may feel that they got alienated somehow. One other question is, can you talk about taking ontologies and standards and making them computable using the semantic web?
Yeah, definitely. Well, semantic web technology, it's widely used by many of this standard community. I mean, when I say format, as I say, this is really broad. There are standards which are expressed in RDF, for example. So absolutely.
So is the when one has data dictionaries for metadata standards, are these sort of go hand in hand? Is there any sort of implication about reproducible science that one can draw from the role of having data dictionaries, linking them with standards, and then using those to help promote reproducible science? Does that make sense?
What is the definition of data dictionary? I think we all have different definitions for everything.
We're going to need a dictionary to keep track of all the terms for data dictionaries and stuff. I think it's just really the the list of it's almost in itself, and it's almost a conflated concept in the sense that you've got a data element and it has, say, a range or a data type, and that these are allowed values. If it's a missing value, it might hold this sort of a value, and so it's almost on one hand it's sort of almost synonymous with an ontology or some sort of metadata standard, but perhaps is there a subtle distinction there, or are we really talking about the same thing?
Well, I think there is a subtle distinction, and to be honest, the classification that I've shown about guideline terminology and format, it's really it's really just a way to try to classify things, because I have colleagues that argue that ontology have a structure, have a format. Of course they are. They are expressed in a format. They are expressed in OWL. They are expressed in OBO format. So I think it's very, very hard to try to box it, these things, because there are slightly different way to structure the information, and it's hard to say which is the right way. The problem is because there is such a variety of way to structure and express the standards that there is a lot of fragmentation as well. But it's also essential.
Yeah, I think, yeah, someone once said the best thing about standards is that there's a lot of them. And so there is a little bit of, in a sense, it is kind of I don't know, there is a variety of them. And people will often vote with their feet on which one they seem to like and it does the best job. And it kind of gets also to the point of versioning of standards. And I'm sure you probably touched on this, at least in brief or in part. And I'm wondering how that factors into the evolution of standards and how important that is, and if you wanted to comment.
It's actually essential. Well, I would say that actually probably versioning, it's in terms of practice, it's used especially in the ontology world, but it's also true in terms of formatting as well. So again, here the practice is not widespread and is still heterogeneous, depending on the community and depending on their approach.
Right. If we have probably. Let's see, are there any other questions here? So one question is, one last one, is are there any emergence of metadata standards which have been developed specifically for computational sciences that you might be aware of?
computation science, I'll definitely refer you especially to the Combine group. Combine brings together computational modeling, system biology. It's called Combined. It's spelled as exactly combined, and brings the right type of standard that perhaps this person is interested. Otherwise, please contact me, and I'll try to actually point you to the right one.
That sounds wonderful. Well, everyone, we're at the top of the hour now, and I'd like to thank Susanna once again for a really fantastic and rich survey of metadata standards and all that that entails. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and to once again tune in next week, as they say, for our next in our series of data science seminars. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.